Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, my beautiful people. I should probably put my phone away. Hello, 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 my beautiful people. Welcome back to the channel. Or if you're new here, hi, welcome to the channel. I wanted to try something new, and this video has been something that's been this video has been something of a passion project for me. And I've been working on it for about 2 or 3 months now because I'm reading this book. Let me get the book. I'm in the process of reading this book, which is The History of Impressionism by John Ruwald. It's a fantastic read, and it's been really engaging. And I read the first 4 chapters, and I'm in a book club, and I realized, like, why don't I just start a book club with the channel, and why don't I sort of share the stuff that I'm learning with you guys, because not everyone has the time to read, and I know there are people who have an interest in art history but don't really know where to start. So as the title says, this is The History of Impressionism by John Ruwald. We're going to be covering chapters 1 through 3 today. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy. I don't have everything memorized, but I took really extensive notes. So if you see me look down or with my phone in my hand, I promise I'm not distracted. I'm referring to my notes. But yeah, I hope you enjoy it. The book starts off in 1885 in France, in Paris, during the World's Fair. And this Universal Exposition is the first of its kind, where it's inviting artists from 28 countries around the world to exhibit their artwork. And this is the first time in history that there was a dedicated exposition, or exhibition, I should say, to international artists. At this time, there's a war happening in Europe, in the Crimean. So here's the thing. I'm really bad. I'm not European. I don't speak French. So I might botch some of the names. I apologize, y'all. Bear with me. But at this time during the World's Fair, there's a war happening in Europe, in the Crimean Peninsula, and the exposition at the World's Fair is an excellent opportunity for the Queen of England and the Emperor Napoleon III of France to sort of show a form of European solidarity. While their soldiers are fighting in Russia, these two are sort of displaying the unity between all of Europe. The first artist that we meet is Camille Pissarro, who is a young artist from the West Indies whose parents send him to Paris to study from some of the known masters. He gets to France not really knowing what to expect, but looking for something. He's looking for a teacher. And the artists that were chosen for the exhibition carefully selected their works because this was an opportunity for everyone in the world, essentially, to see who you were, and it was a place for you to showcase your skills and how talented you are. This exhibition at the World Fair was particularly competitive because this was the first time in history that artists in Europe got to show their work against all of the eligible countries in the world. Among some of the artists that were showcasing in the World Fair among the artists that are exhibiting at the World Fair are Eugene Delacroix, and he is the first artist that we meet who is sort of a game changer, because during this exhibition he curates a group of works of his own that sort of shows his artistic evolution throughout his life of drawings and paintings. And this is the first time in history that we see a sort of one-man show or solo show, which is groundbreaking. On the other side of that coin, we have Jean-Dominique, what's his name? Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who is, the industry leader at this time of painting. He sort of sets the tone for what looks good. He's the guy. He's the tastemaker. And so Ingres is important because for 20 years he avoided sending his work to the World's Fair or to the Salon because, he sort of saw it as a waste of his time, and he didn't really want to hear from critics, which is like, who can blame him, right? And among the works that he submits, he sends the Turkish Bathers painting. But right? The catch is it's at a collector's home. The collector is refusing to send this painting to Ang because he feels like it's his. And so the son of a banker who turns out to be Edgar Degas is 20 years old, and he convinces the collector to give the painting to Ang because he's like, who are you to deny a master his request? Which is like, yeah, man, give me my stuff. And at the same time, Edgar Degas is about to quit his law studies to become a painter. And he goes to the studio of Ang because Ang wants to meet the young man who convinced his collector to give him his painting for the Salon. And Ang meets Degas and he tells him, and I quote, "Draw lines, young man, many lines, from memory or from nature. It is in this way that you will become a good artist." And that is one of the central pieces of what all of these old master painters truly believed, which is to draw consistently and to draw anything and everything that you could possibly see. And so we find ourselves back at the Salon, and young Pissarro is walking through the halls, and he's looking at over 5,000 paintings, and there's so many paintings that are hung that some of them are even touching. It's almost overwhelming. It's like overstimulating how many artworks there are. But the one painting he sees that leaves a lasting impression is Ang's Turkish Bathers piece. And being that Ang is the industry leader, he gets to exhibit over 40 paintings and 3 drawings in a special room. While he's off in his own special room, Delacroix exhibits 35 paintings. And at this point in time, we're sort of being set up to understand that there's a battle between 2 different schools of thought, which is the Delacroix school and the Ang school, and we'll kind of get to that later. Some of the other memorable painters who later in history become famous or influential that are also hanging in these galleries are Monet, Joan Kind, Clairo, and Daubigny. And so at this time, poets and writers and painters all kind of hang out, and some of the voices of influence are the poets. And the poet of influence that we're talking about right now is Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire writes about the triumph of Delacroix and how Ang's work is stripped of the magic that forms destiny. And of course, what kind of art competition is it without medals and ribbons? And of course, because Ang is the school leader, or not the school leader, but sort of the artistic thought leader, all of the medals and awards go to people whose work looks like Ang's, because why not, right? And of the painters who didn't receive medals, we have one, Courbet. And Courbet feels like his work is wrongly rejected. And so because 2 paintings get rejected by the jury, he builds a pavilion that houses 50 artworks. And Courbet's show in the pavilion is mostly unsuccessful, but it has an impact on Delacroix. And he goes and he buys a ticket multiple days in a row, and he just sits in there and he admires the beautiful work that he sees. And Delacroix comes to the conclusion that he's looking at masterpieces. And one of the works in particular that was rejected by the jury is one of Courbet's most famous works of all time. And it was incredibly controversial at the time, but it was The Painter's Studio, a true allegory defining a 7-year phase of my artistic life. The idea behind this painting was to record the personalities and people that were influential on him and the people that came by the studio. And the work was bizarre because it was surreal in a way, because it's showing an artist making they're painting a nude model. But you can see the backdrop, and then you also see the artist surrounded by writers and other painters. And it is, it's almost breaking the fourth wall. And at the time, we've never seen anything like this. And the jury is conservative, and they don't know how to handle this, so they just reject it, which will be a running theme in this book, from what I can tell. Essentially, the painting was radical in both its philosophy and its technique. And by rejecting the painting, the jury essentially says, and I quote, "At all costs, a stop has to be out to Courbet's painting tendencies, which are disastrous for French art." Essentially, they're afraid of change and of things that might destroy how painting and artworks are viewed in France and in the world, and how it might reflect on the country. Like I said earlier, Ingres is the public favorite, and they really love his style of classicism, and it really sort of sets the tone and pace for what everyone should be striving for with how their artwork looks. Couture was also a favorite of the public because of how he blended the Venetians, classicism, romanticism, and realism. And to put it quite frankly, the public wasn't ready for something as revolutionary and game-changing as Courbet's painting of the allegory of the artist in the studio. And in the words of Courbet, the world wasn't ready for an artist to produce living art. After having seen the Salon, Pissarro goes and finds Corot. And so he goes to his studio so he can find a teacher like his parents wanted him to do when he originally got to France. And so when Pissarro finds Corot tells him the first two things that you need to study are form and value, because those two things are the foundational basis for what art is, and color and execution give charm to the work, in the words of Corot. Pissarro feels that he needs a little bit more work under his belt before he can get valued criticism from Corot, so he enrolls in an atelier. So Pissarro sort of bounces from studio to studio, never really finding a home. He studies under Ingres and Lehmann, and while he's sort of trying to find his way in the world of art studios, Pissarro realizes that the career of an artist sort of follows very closely the career of someone who finds himself in the military.
Sir, the private said no, sir, sir!
Why, you little maggot! You make me want to vomit!
And what I mean by that is there are certain paths that an artist can follow that will take them to certain destinations, and there are strict rules, and there's not much freedom like how we know art is today, where you can kind of do or be whoever you want. And Pissarro discovers that there are unwritten rules that are essentially a step-by-step guide on how to gain influence and power as an artist. And with that influence and power, you get fame and wealth. And sort of the peak of what an art student wanted to achieve was getting into the École des Beaux-Arts, which is where an artist gets their foot in the door to be on their way to gaining fame, wealth, and influence. Students that graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts wound up as teachers at the Academy in Rome and at the École des Beaux-Arts. And the Academy controlled the jury, which selected submissions for the Salon, which also meant they selected who was rewarded the medals from the Salon. And so through its influence, the Academy essentially selected what was purchased by museums, by the emperor, and by the upper class of citizens. And obviously, the Academy favored the students that didn't try to buck the trend or change the direction of art. The artists who were most docile were rewarded. And so if you didn't rock the boat, you upheld the status quo, and because of the Academy's influence, they determined what the public thought was good or bad. Isn't that crazy that even though things change, things still stay the same?
Message!
And so the ideals that led the Academy and were the shining light were teachings put in place by David. And they were sort of taken a step further and reinforced by David's most famous student, Ingres. And so by the time Pissarro gets to Paris in 1855, Ingres has been a member of the academy for over 30 years. And it was well known that Ang was a rigid man who wasn't a fan of change. He was sort of a really strict and dominating figure, which meant that he was naturally the enemy, artistically, of Delacroix. He actually despised Delacroix's work and what it stood for. And funny enough, Ang's love for the classics and the past blinded him from what was happening right before his eyes, which was, Paris at this time it's turning into a bubbling pot of new ideas and unconventional theories. And he can't see that because he's so focused on upholding the tradition of art. And because he's trying to protect it from anything that might stain it in his eyes, he can't see where it's going in the future. Because Ang was just so naturally gifted, it meant that he was a bad teacher. Because, I'm not quite sure if it's because he didn't have to work as hard to be as great of an artist, or if, he can't translate what makes him so great to other people. But in any event, he was a bad teacher, and he sort of told his students to copy the model blindly, which just kind of means, to copy exactly what you see with no thought. And it almost kind of made the drawings lifeless. And something that sort of defined who Ang was as a teacher and as an artist was that he stressed the importance of line over color. And so essentially he's making drawings that get colored in, because if the drawing's wrong, the painting's wrong in his eyes. Which is funny because there's in modern times there's a ton of artists who sort of do the same thing. They think they're painting, but they're not. They're sort of just making outline drawings and then filling it in like a paint by number situation. It's not until we meet artists like Delacroix and others that come along a little bit later that we realize, okay, there is another way to see painting, which is less linear and more form and color based. So the students of Ang saw Clairo and Delacroix's work as poorly drawn, and it's funny, right? They're completely missing the ideas behind those paintings because they're so focused on pleasing their teacher. They're approaching art without an open mind. And so because of that, these students thought that the gold standard was to make perfect line copies of what was in front of them, which led to their work looking cheap and like an imitation of an artist way greater than them. And it's not their fault that they didn't, that they couldn't be him. Or maybe it is, because they should have known better. I think it's kind of funny that Ang thought that the Salon stifled beauty in art, because all of the artists, or at least most of the artists that won awards, made art that looked exactly like his. But essentially, the Salon was just a glorified art market. It was a mall where people with money went to go and purchase talking pieces or things to sort of decorate their homes. It's not like the majority of the people who were going were scholars and who actually thought about art in any substantial manner. It was more so something that the bourgeoisie did to spend time and money and to find things to line the walls of their home. And on top of that, a lot of the well-known artists didn't exhibit in the Salon because they didn't have to find customers that way. And so the Salon was more so a place for young and up-and-coming artists to sort of get a foothold on some sort of clientele, which is interesting because we kind of have that nowadays with all of the art fairs, maybe not to such a grand extent as the Salon or the Biennial that happened in Paris around these times, but the sentiment remains the same, where people who aren't necessarily interested in art but go to spend money because it's something to do, and they're just looking for ways to spend time. And to even touch on the sort of rivalry between Ang and Delacroix, Ang despised Delacroix for abandoning the systematic nude and sort of favoring individualism over the greater good of art. Essentially, Ang felt that Delacroix was choosing to go down his own path instead of following the status quo, which, if art history has taught us anything, history favors the bold and those who venture off on their own to sort of discover new doorways or paths to expressing themselves. And Ang was also sort of horrified at Delacroix's interest in political events and making paintings of the barricades or the Greeks' fight for independence. And, Ang essentially focused on making paintings that were centered around the past or sort of less polarizing topics. And so Ang catered to his constituents by painting monarchs and wealthy folks. And because of this rivalry between Ang and Delacroix, it was almost like the system versus the individual. And Ang and his followers made a concentrated effort to eliminate Delacroix they made an effort to eliminate him from the conversation. And in doing so, they did everything in their power to strip him of influence. He was denied candidacy to the Academy over 6 times. Honestly, this is what an all-time hater looks like. Delacroix and his students or his followers disliked this man so much that they felt like he was a danger to their way of life, and so they did everything they could to ostracize him. And it worked. And so while among young painters, it was always the same subjects that came up when they got into heated debates. Ang versus Delacroix, classicism versus romanticism, line versus color. And, these things sort of dictated what kind of artist you were. And while people argued back and forth, whether it was Ang or Delacroix or whoever else, Delacroix just threw himself into his work, because if he couldn't get his way by getting into the Academy, the only thing he could control was focusing on his art. So he did. And, around this time, there were very few alternatives to the École des Beaux-Arts. There were sort of individual studios around Paris where students could go to learn from different teachers. There was one studio where one of the masters focused on teaching artists how to make drawings and paintings completely from memory, which is super cool, and I would love to learn how to do that. And I don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to put it down over here. His name was Lévin de Bois-Bourron. I'm going to get better at French as I read the book, I promise. Along with Lévin, there was also Thomas Couture. And, neither of these masters had very full classes because, like I said earlier, most artists wanted to get into the École des Beaux-Arts. And so while that was the pinnacle of what you should reach for as a young artist, there were these places on the side that you could kind of go to learn different pieces of being an artist. And it's funny, right? Like, while there's this heated rivalry between Delacroix and Ang, Couture is over here on the side as like some other third thing. And he's this really arrogant man who feels like he's actually the best of the three. He feels like he should be the thought leader. And it's funny because his work actually sort of mirrors Ang. It's slightly different. Couture's, where he differs from Ang, is that he adds a little bit more color and he's a little more stylized, even though Ang is also very stylized as well. But Couture, he liked to choose thinner models because then you could add stuff on, as opposed to bigger models that had, then maybe they weighed a little more, they had more muscles, because then, you can't really see the person, so you don't know what to remove or what to add. And, one of the things that comes from being this artist that's not really in the main conversation of, who's the best out of Ang or Delacroix, Couture is just like a hater, and he'll talk, and anyone who will listen to him, he'll talk down to any of the other artists that are sort of having any kind of motion at the time. So, he's talking down on Monet, he's talking down on Ang, Delacroix, literally anybody. He does not like you, and he means that. He probably had a burn book.
This girl is the nastiest skank I've ever met.
One of the students of Couture is actually Edouard Manet, and even though Manet's teacher is nothing but negative about Delacroix, Manet finds the courage to go to Delacroix's studio and ask him, can he copy one of his paintings, which is Dante and Virgil? While all of this is happening in the Pavilion of Realism, Edgar Degas is deeply moved by Manet and Courbet, and he decides to not pursue law, and he wants to become a painter. And so, with his father's permission, he does exactly that. He drops out of law school and he pursues being a painter full time. But, eventually Degas kind of gets bored of Paris, and so he goes to Italy, where he can study from the classics. And honestly, Degas loves being away from all the hustle and bustle of the big city of Paris, because he feels like that the art market closely resembles that of the stock market, and you sort of have to have good relationship with your neighbors, and you constantly have to be a good businessman, which is something that is still true to this day. The art market is just another form of the stock market. While Degas is off in Italy being alone, Pissarro also feels like he needs some space from the city, and so he's like looking around, and he realizes like there's no places for me to see contemporary art, because art galleries don't really exist like we know them today. Artists hang their works in like framing shops and stuff, but it's not really a way to consistently see new art. And outside of the Louvre, there's only really one other place in Europe, and that's the museum in Luxembourg. A part of why you can't see new and engaging art right now is because the Academy decides what goes up. They have an iron grip on the fabric of art of the time. They decide what's worth being seen and what's garbage. And so young artists almost unknowingly form a resistance naturally to the Academy without even trying. And so they eventually start meeting up at cafes to discuss what's going on and their theories on art and what they feel like should be happening in the art world. And, it's kind of like how New York is right now, where there's different cafes for different personalities. And so like different groups of artists had their designated cafes and where you could go to hear a certain kind of argument. So you've got the Cafe Tehran, where Fontaine and his followers go to meet. You've got the Cafe Fleurus, where Clairo and Gleyre and his followers go to meet. Cafe Tortoni is where, if you were a fashionable painter, this is where you go. You're a fly guy, you've got good taste, you got interesting thoughts. That's where we find you, Cafe Tortoni. But something that I wasn't quite sure of while I was reading this part of the book was if he meant aesthetically or fashionably you're meeting at Cafe Tortoni. But you know what? In my mind, I like to think that you're fly and you make fly paintings, you're going to Cafe Tortoni. That's where I be. You know what I mean? Just hanging out, sipping my little tea, maybe a beer. I don't drink. Something. I'm sipping something, right? Yelling. And then the bohemian painters, sort of the more extreme artists, are hanging out at the Brasserie des Martyrs. And finally, Courbet frequents the Cafe Andler Teller, where, you can find poets, critics, philosophers, essentially any walk of art life you'll find at this cafe. And so in these smoke-filled back rooms, I like to imagine it's like black and white, but in these smoke-filled rooms, this is where these painters and poets and critics and journalists are arguing about the different schools of thought of the day and what they feel like is most important when it comes to being an artist and what the soul of each movement is. So they're arguing Ingres versus Delacroix, line versus color, realist versus fantasist. It's just, people are yelling. It's loud in here. It's like a Thanksgiving after the turkey's been cut. An important person, or maybe not an important person, an important person in this story who kind of hangs out and soaks up all of these different arguments in the Brasserie des Martyrs is Edmond Durand. Edmond Durante. Yeah, in 1856, he founds like a short-lived periodical called Realism. And in it, he has this quote. In an article on painting, he complains how there's an abundance of Greek, Roman, medieval, and visions of the 16th, 17th, 18th century art that are sort of pervasive in the work of today. But no one is painting in the style of the 19th century. And what I mean by the style of the 19th century is that no one is making work from life around them, which is what all of the ancient cultures back then did. He's making this complaint that we are so caught up on the past that we're not able to look at what's happening around us, and we're robbing ourselves of the beauty of life. There's a quote from Edmond Durante, and he says, "The man of antiquity created what he saw. He told the contemporary painters of the day, create what you see," which is something that honestly I feel like no matter what century you're in, even like us now, like that's something that we can and should do. Like we should focus on what's in front of us instead of sort of looking to the past. I mean, there's nothing wrong with looking to the past, but life is so beautiful. The main point is that the painters at the Brasserie felt that the more the Academy tried to push on the public that they were upholding the standards and the sacred traditions of art, these young painters pushed back and like really questioned, are you really upholding what it is to make art? As time goes on, the younger generation is detaching itself from the philosophy of the Academy. In the Salon of 1857, Courbet sends in I want to say six or so paintings, and one of them was so shocking it was seen as vulgar and crass, and the name of the painting was Young Ladies on the Banks of the Seine. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry, I'm gonna put the name down. And the whole reason that this painting by Courbet was seen as vulgar and shocking was because it was a painting of two women who weren't considered to be a part of high society, which is insane, right? Like, he's making these paintings about the life around him, but because it's not of the upper class, it's appalling for the viewer to see. It's almost shameful to even be admitted by something of the Academy or the jury. Another sort of landmark in the year of 1857 is that the Academy finally feels like it has nothing to fear from Delacroix, and it's partially because of his old age. They feel like whatever little influence he has now has waned, and because Delacroix is so old, he doesn't even have the energy to take up a professorship where he can sort of nurture and guide younger painters into sort of thinking for themselves and developing a personal style that exists outside of the Academy. But as a member of the jury for the Salon, you know, Delacroix is one of, if not the only person who has sort of a radical and open mind. And so whatever opinion or whatever works of art that he's seeing that he wants to admit, they're denied because, you know, it's one against everyone. 2 years after Delacroix's appointment as a member of the jury, he finds himself in favor of admitting a painting by Edward Manet, which is Manet's first submission into the Salon. And it's funny, right? Like, these younger painters like Manet, Fantin, Latour, and Whistler all angered the judges because, you know, the judges are still in the school of thought of Ingres, which is line over everything. And these younger painters like Manet are focused on color and form, which is the cardinal sin of the day. And so the jury doesn't see these paintings as revolutionary, but more so a slap in the face. So the rejections were so egregious that the artists organized a protest, and the protest actually got so crazy that the police had to come and settle everyone down, which is one thing I will give the French. Those people know how to protest. They not going for nothing, bro. They don't like it. They not taking it. Respect it. And so while the painters who were rejected couldn't get their work into the Salon, there was an artist by the name of Boudin who decided to have an exhibition of his own where he would allow all of the artists who were rejected to showcase their work and let the art community decide for themselves whether they thought these paintings were so bad. And this exhibition that Bonvin threw was scandalous, and it was almost like the speakeasy of artistry, where these painters who aren't supposed to be showing this vulgar work have somehow found their way onto the walls of another artist, and it became a famous show in the city of Paris. The only one of our painters who found any sort of success with the jury was Pissarro. He spent his summer outside of Paris in Montmorency. In 1859, he sends in a landscape, and with this submission that was accepted by the jury, he can finally report back to his parents that he's achieved some sort of success in Paris and it wasn't all a wash. So, he's making a name for himself. During this salon that Pissarro gets accepted to and is showing his landscape, we get a young Monet coming to the salon to see the works in Paris. Claude Oscar Monet spent a great deal of his time as a kid drawing instead of paying attention in class, which, who can't relate to that? By the time he was 15, he was known all over his town, Le Havre, as a great caricature artist. And his name actually got so popular that at one point he was able to charge 20 francs a piece for each drawing, which actually caused a scandal for his family. It was embarrassing that, maybe not embarrassing, it was sort of seen as uncouth or unbecoming to charge people to make these little doodles of them. But Monet was able to strike a deal with a frame maker by the name of Eugene Boudin, who actually turned out to be a painter who specialized in painting seascapes. But Monet was allowed to hang his caricatures in the window of the frame shop. But funny enough, Monet actually hated the work of Eugene Boudin because, he thought the work, honestly, he thought the work was tacky. And, he wasn't really feeling that. He was more interested in making his cartoons. And this wasn't his fault, but he was more in line with Ingres, which was the visual language that was popular at the time. So Monet goes out of his way to avoid Boudin every time he's in the shop. But one day, Monet's in the shop and Boudin is in the back of the shop, and there's no escaping it. So they eventually meet and have a conversation. And Boudin actually encourages our young Monet to continue making artwork. And he actually says this, and I'm going to look at my phone for the quote. Sorry. I'm not sorry, actually. I always look at your sketches with pleasure. They are amusing, clever, bright. You're gifted. One can see that at a glance, but I hope you're not going to stop there. Study, learn to see and paint, draw, make landscapes. The sea and the sky, the animals, the people, and the trees are so beautiful, just as nature has made them, with their character, their genuineness, in the light, in the surf, just as they are. Essentially encouraging Monet to just draw any and everything that he can, which once again is a common theme that all of the great masters tell younger artists. Draw everything and don't stop for anything. But unfortunately, this pep talk or these words of encouragement sort of fall on deaf ears because Monet's not hearing any of that. Bro, he's like, bro, I don't even like what you make. What are you talking about, bro? Boudin is so persistent, and he actually invites our young Monet out to draw or paint with him in the forest. And Monet's like, nah, I have better things to do. Dude, I'm good, right? And so for months, Monet's making up excuses, and then eventually school lets out, so Monet doesn't really have any excuses anymore. And so he essentially is obliged to go with Boudin to make these sketches in the forest. And as unwilling as Monet was in the beginning, studying with Boudin actually opened Monet's eyes to the beauty of the world and to have a deeper relationship with his surroundings and with nature, and to just see the world for what it is and to enjoy that. This studying with Boudin would have a dramatic effect on Monet later in his life, because this was one of the first steps towards unlocking his relationship with the outside world. The thing I love about this book is that it draws connections between these painters that sort of, it's seemingly arbitrary, but once you sort of get towards the end of these stories, you see that there's this common thread that ties all of these people together. For example, 14 years earlier in 1844, when Boudin was 20, he owned a stationery store. And this is the exact store where he later meets Monet. But among our young Boudin's clients are Couture and Troyan. After meeting Troyan, Boudin starts to paint in his style. And in 1855, Manet arrives in Le Havre, and he's doing portraits for wealthy clients in the city for about 30 francs a piece, which actually is crazy if you think about it, because that means Monet was making money at 15, but Manet is doing these portraits for his clients, and he's getting supplies at Boudin's stationery shop. Boudin sort of takes this opportunity to speak with Manet and bring out some of his own paintings, and Manet actually corrects some of them and, helps him to improve some of these paintings. And this is sort of a watershed moment for Boudin, where he realizes, like, dude, I don't want to own a stationery shop. I want to be a painter. So he sells the shop and he goes to Paris. While in Paris, he goes to the Louvre to make copies from the masters. Shortly after Boudin's arrival in Paris, 2 of his paintings are purchased by the Society of Friends of Le Havre. And then the following year, 3 of Boudin's clients, including Troyan and Couture, actually sponsor Boudin's trip to Paris for him to study for 3 years. And instead of doing like these cute little genre paintings that everyone's doing at the time, Boudin decides to do paintings out in the open, which is sort of uncommon at the time, or maybe not uncommon, but it's not popular. And this sort of inclination or conviction to paint in the open air is what Boudin tried to impart on young Monet. But like I said, Monet's not hearing that, bro. Dude, I don't even like the shit you make. I'm just here so I don't get fined. But most importantly, Boudin thought that everything that was painted on the spot had a more vivid and powerful feeling, and that's something you just can't get from doing in the studio. So after 6 months of studying with Boudin, Monet decides to tell his father he wants to move to Paris and to study and to become a real full-time painter. And as luck would have it, Monet's aunt had a studio in her attic because she painted as a pastime, which was something that a lot of women of high society chose to do. Unfortunately, Monet's father couldn't afford to send Monet to Paris, so he actually wrote a letter to the municipal council to get a scholarship for Monet to study in the city of Paris. 2 months later, the council actually rejected Monet's request for sponsorship because they were afraid that his inclination for caricature would lead him to be less serious about his studies. So they thought they would waste their money on him, sending him to Paris. Monet's father was a go-getter, you know what I'm saying? He wasn't about to wait for permission for some council to say, yeah, we'll give you the bread. Monet's father actually sent Monet to Paris earlier before he even heard a response back. He sent him to Paris for 2 months so he could go see the Salon and actually seek the counsel of professional painters and maybe find a way into the city that way. And luckily, Monet's earnings that he made from doing the caricatures when he was 15 actually helped him stay afloat while he was in the city. While Monet's in the city, he's actually advised to study with Couture, but Monet was against the idea because he felt that he would lose his freedom of action, and above all, he disliked Couture's work, which, looking back on it, Monet had such a distinct taste and he knew what he liked and what he didn't, which I guess is why he's one of the greats right now. But it's crazy, he didn't like nobody. And so instead of going to study with Couture, Monet is hanging out at the cafe, specifically the Brasserie des Martyrs. And so he finds companionship, he hears spirited debates about what's going on in the art world, and after about 2 months, he decides he's going to stay in Paris indefinitely. Most importantly, Monet felt like he didn't want to join the École des Beaux-Arts, and so he didn't. And his father was furious, so he actually cut off his allowance. But Monet, being the man that he was, that did not faze him. He honestly, bro, cut my allowance off. I've been making money since I was 15. I've been a man, right? So Monet's been a hustler since day one, and he was going to do whatever he wanted, and he wasn't going to study with people that he didn't like. So at the Brasserie des Martyrs, Monet's hanging around poets and critics, and he meets this writer named Champfleury. Once again, I'm going to mispronounce his name. It'll be down here. And Champfleury writes this story about the 3 cheeses. The story of the 3 cheeses goes like this. During the Salon selection, the jury is looking at paintings being submitted, They get a painting of a cheddar cheese by an English painter, which they see it, they like it, they pass it through. Next, they get a painting of a Dutch cheese by a Flemish painter. And they think, well, we just got a cheese by an English painter, but this one's okay, we'll let it slide. So they pass that one through. Lastly, they get a painting of a brie cheese by a Frenchman, and they reject it. Even though the brie cheese was painted more realistically than the first two cheeses, the jury wants nothing to do with it. The French painter's confused, but a philosopher in the bar leans over and tells him, and I need the exact quote for this, y'all. In France, painting with ideas is not light. There's an idea in your picture, that is why you got excluded. The members of the jury accepted the cheddar and the Dutch cheese because they don't contain anything subversive, but they judged your brie to be a demagogic picture. The idea must have shocked them. It's a poor man's cheese. The knife with its horn handle and worn blade is a proletarian's knife. It was noted that you have a fierce liking for the utensils of poor people. You are judged demagogic, and you are. You're an anarchist without knowing it. And I felt like that was such a profound statement. And to me, what I took away from that is good art is profound, and it is subversive, and it has the ability to inspire anarchy, even if that's not your direct intention with whatever you make. But subject matter was something that was of the utmost importance at this time in France, and no other painter was more aggressive with his subject matter than Courbet. He actually antagonized Ingres and Delacroix with his subject matter. As a sort of reaction against Romanticism and Classicism, Courbet found his subjects in everyday life. Ingres had a sort of willful ignorance. He had a willful ignorance of the more trivial aspects of life, which sort of led him and his followers to pettiness. And Delacroix had a tendency to lean more towards melodrama, and so his works were just more dramatic. And Courbet, he chose to focus on everyday life and the things that just happen that we might not think twice about. For example, in Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People, Delacroix painted the spirit of the fight and less actually the people. He didn't focus on the individuals that might have actually been there. It was more about what the event felt like, which sums up most of what Delacroix's paintings were about. The emotional feeling you can get from an event or a place or a person. That painting became an allegory for the spirit of liberty. But Courbet avoided allegory altogether and solely focused his works on that of his contemporaries and the lower class people. And Courbet actually thought that his paintings were more of a social commentary, and he sort of brought new life into subject matter. And speaking of social commentary, in 1948, Napoleon III actually broke his oath to the Constitution and proclaimed himself the emperor, and a ruthless and rigid censorship followed. This censorship put a muzzle on liberal press, and writers were actually prosecuted. In the summer of 1859, after a successful victory against the Austrians in the Crimean War, Napoleon actually gave amnesty to all political exiles that were in France. Out of all of the exiles, there was a poet named Victor Hugo who actually declined the amnesty. Later that year, he put out an epic volume of poems titled La Légende des Siècles. The French press attacked it. The Catholic Church actually deplored it, and anyone who was sort of a free-thinking individual. And Victor Hugo was lumped in with Delacroix, because both of these artists were devoted to the cult of imagination and color and sacrificed everything to get their desired effect. Monet, on the other hand, actually shunned the idea of subject matter altogether and surrounded himself with exclusively landscapists. In 1860, a large exhibition of modern paintings was shown without the oversight or permission of the Academy, and it was a stark contrast to what had been shown publicly in comparison to previous years, and it was full of brilliance, life, color, and strength. Shortly after this show was put together, Monet was conscripted to the French military. His name was called in the lottery, and he was sentenced to serve 7 years in the army. Monet's father insisted on buying a substitute if Monet would bend to his father's will, but Monet was strangely enough, looking forward to going to the military because he was keen on having all sorts of different adventures. He had sort of romanticized the idea of being a soldier. And when it was time for Monet to serve, he was sent to Algeria for 2 years. And his time in Algeria really informed his use of light and color. In 1861, Manet submitted 2 paintings to the Salon, and the jury reluctantly accepted them, and they continued to hate on him, and they hung the pieces horribly. One of the pieces hung was the Spanish guitar player, which was a revolutionary use of technique. Many of the young painters that went and saw this artwork were dumbfounded. They thought it was cutting edge and beautiful. Anyone who saw the painting could visually see Manet's inspiration of Goya and Velázquez and using modern accents in the painting. This artwork sort of marks the start of a new school of painting. And towards the end of 1861, we see a rise of young painters who are dissatisfied with the school's ateliers and their current masters, and they're looking for a new teacher to sort of lead the charge into the future. And their first thought was Courbet. And Courbet, his first thought was no. Like, he thought that every artist should lead his own charge. So instead of being a teacher for everyone, he opened up a studio where everyone could chip in and they could do live drawings from models together in a studio, and he could sort of lend his advice to them, but he wouldn't be their teacher. They would almost be he saw them as collaborators, much like the old masters of the Renaissance. In the first weeks of January of 1862, the students flocked to the studio, and soon there were over 40 people in the studio painting away. And the studio sort of built up a reputation in the town for having a live bull that they would put in the studio. And, you know, it was like a small piece of gossip that was going around Paris at the time. In April of 1862, the studio closed down because Courbet frankly got tired of teaching. But this was one of the first steps towards getting rid of the École des Beaux-Arts, which, you know, was one of the foundational pillars of art society in Paris at the time. The École was losing its hold on the students. In March of 1862, a governing commission was appointed to institute changes to the École, the Academy of Rome, and the Salon. So we have some new changes. At the beginning of 1862, Monet gets sick and he actually gets sent home from Algiers. And so for about 6 months, Monet just spends a bunch of time drawing and painting while he's recovering. The doctor warned him that if he returned to Algiers, he might face life-threatening consequences. So his dad does what any responsible parent would do and pays for his son to leave the military. This was actually the perfect opportunity for Monet's father to exert his control over his son. And he told him, I will send you to Paris, and the only way you're gonna continue to have an allowance is if you look for and study underneath an actual professional artist. And Monet reluctantly agrees, and he goes to find a studio to study in. So Monet finds a painter named Toulmouche. I'm sorry, I speak Spanish, I don't speak French. Toulmouche, I'll put it over here. Toulmouche is known for painting women in sort of decadent scenes, which, if we know anything about Monet at this point, that's almost the exact opposite of what he's interested in. So Monet paints a scene of butter and a kidney, and he shows it to Toulmouche, and Toulmouche tells him, okay, well, you need to study under... Toulmouche tells Monet he needs to study under Gleyre. So that's exactly what Monet does. In Gleyre's studio, Monet's not exactly happy. Gleyre isn't particularly happy with Monet either, because Gleyre thinks that Monet is making his paintings look too much like the model. Who would have thought that is a bad thing? Gleyre thought that Monet captured too much of the ugly truth. Gleyre thought that nature offered a nice element, but style was where the real magic was in a painting. This philosophy that Gleyre had was almost the exact opposite of what Monet learned from Boudin. So it sort of put up a barrier between the two artists, Monet and Gleyre. In 1862, another painter enters Gleyre's studio, and that is Auguste Renoir. And he's also sort of dissatisfied with the teachings of Gleyre. And one day, Gleyre is sort of walking around the studio looking at the students' work, and he sees Renoir and what he's painting, and Gleyre's like, he's like, clearly you must be enjoying yourself by how you're dabbling this paint. And Renoir responds, of course I'm enjoying myself. Like, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't like it. And, you know, this rebellious spirit that Renoir had allows Monet and himself to be kindred spirits and develop a relationship. Another artist who joined Monet and Renoir in the class was Alfred Sisley. He was an English painter. And Alfred came from a very wealthy family that dealt in the silk trade. But upon a visit to Paris and seeing the Louvre, Alfred came back to England, and he felt like he didn't want to pursue his family's trade. He was more interested in being an artist. And so he begged his father to allow him to pursue being a painter. And so in October of 1862, he joins Gleyre's studio, and he links up with Renoir and Monet. The funny thing about Gleyre and his studio, he was worried that the idea of devilish color would get to his students' heads and sort of distract them from the task at hand. So he had advised them to make their palettes beforehand. So they were working with prepared palettes. It was Renoir who seemed to have an affinity for color from the very beginning, which made him an outsider in the class, even though, you know, some of the other students shouted and broke glass and, you know, threw things. Renoir was seen as the actual rebel, even though he sat in his corner and made his paintings just as he was instructed to do. But Renoir was truly a student of the game, and so he goes to night classes at the École des Beaux-Arts when he's not at Gleyre's studio, and he's taking anatomy and drawing classes. But one of his professors at the École tells him, be careful to not become the next Delacroix. Which is funny, right? Like, they're so fearful of this older painter and his ideas, and the institution has no idea that these ideas are going to find their way out one way or another. In Gleyre's studio, Monet was the first of his trio of friends to openly rebel, and partly it's because he had this outside education that he got from Boudin and studying and making paintings out in the world, as well as just the discussions that he had at the Brasserie des Martyrs. And so soon, Monet and his friends decided to turn to the Louvre to study from masters of the past. And Monet decided to study from... Monet copied Delacroix, Titian, Velázquez, Tintoretto, and of course Rembrandt. Meanwhile, Degas copied Delacroix, Poussin, and the Italian primitives, as well as Holbein. And the painter who truly copied the most was Fantin. And he has a long list of artists that he looked at, so give me a second. He copied from Delacroix, Veronese, Titian, Giorgione, Tintoretto, Rubens, Rembrandt, Hals, Dehuch, Vermeer, Chardin, and Watteau. Renoir became close with Fantin, and he would take him to the Louvre all the time, and Fantin would just always tell him, like, yo man, we gotta go to the Louvre. There's nothing out, there's nowhere else we need to be. We need to go and study from the masters. He told him, you could literally never copy enough. All Monet looked at was landscapes. He was kind of annoyed at anything else, and he quite honestly detested Ingres. There were also two sisters that copied at the Louvre. Their names were Edna and Bertha Morisot. They were the daughters of a rich magistrate, and they took painting more seriously than the women of their social standing. They weren't really satisfied with their copying. They meet Clairo in 1861, and he allows them to watch him make a drawing or make a painting. And he also lends them some of his paintings so that they can copy from it, which is really cool that he trusted them so much that he felt comfortable to loan out some of his paintings. Corot had a tendency to attract the new generation that were more timid. Meanwhile, the bolder ones turned to Courbet and Manet. And so the Salon of 1863 is drawing near, but our trio of friends, Monet, Renoir, or Sicily, they don't submit anything because they're sort of learning the rules of how the game of the Salon is played. And it's a dirty game. In prior years, it had happened that the jurors didn't look at the signatures, and so they wound up rejecting some of the artworks that were submitted by some of the members on the jury themselves. And to avoid this happening again, they established a rule that all Academy members and artists that were awarded medals did not have to submit their artworks to the jury to be accepted into the Salon. And so the danger of being rejected was only for artists who hadn't made a name for themselves yet. And the teachers of different studios and members of the jury did everything in their power to protect their own students. And so they established sort of a quid pro quo where if you vote for my student, I'll vote for yours. And then, to get some of the more coveted spots in the Salon, if you could afford it, people were paying off janitors to get the best spots in the house so that their work could be seen by potential buyers. And another potential issue was obtaining favorable press, which was something that you could either buy or just have the right relationships and people would talk favorably about you. All of these things played a role in artists selling work or not. And if you didn't sell work, your career was dead in the water. Artists' work who may not have been purchased, or if you were rejected by the jury, people who bought your artwork would return it back to you out of sheer embarrassment of owning a piece by someone who was rejected by the prestigious Salon. And a new rule was admitted where you could only submit 3 artworks at a time. And the jury of 1863 was the most severe that it had ever been, and many artists that had been admitted previously were rejected. Delacroix was too ill to sort of flex his influence on the jury, so, it was almost as if he wasn't even there. But he wasn't sick enough that he couldn't make a showing of Manet's paintings at Martinet's. And among the 24 canvases that Manet was showing was Lola de Valence, Spanish Dancers, and Tuileries Gardens. And people seeing Manet's paintings laughed to the point of crying. Like, they were literally in tears. And they even threatened to tear up or cut up his painting. Delacroix, after he saw the show, he said, my only regret is that I couldn't defend Manet. The jury starts deliberating around April 2nd, and there's a rumor swirling in the city that the jury is going to commit a metaphorical massacre on the artists by, rejecting a record number of works. And so it turns out that out of the 5,000 paintings that were submitted, over 3,000 were rejected. And so Martinet, who in the past had exhibited rejected painters like Manet, he was overwhelmed with requests to showcase other artworks. But he physically didn't have the space to show 3,000 paintings. Like, where was he going to put those things? The painting community's outcry was so large that it caught the ear of Napoleon III. And so on April 22nd, Napoleon goes to where the Salon is and he looks at the paintings that were rejected and he has a brilliant idea. And quite frankly, it's a revolutionary and game-changing move that he presents. The emperor makes a sensational decision that he announces 2 days later, which is that he's going to have an exhibition of all of the artworks that were refused, the Salon Des Refuses. And so this exhibition of rejected artworks would open the exhibition opens on May 15th, 14 days after the initial Salon opens. And all of the artists were excited because it finally meant that the public got to judge their artwork and they didn't have people's thoughts chosen for them by the jury. The artists who were rejected, it was almost a sense of pride that your work was seen so different from the status quo that you were put into this separate exhibit from the rest of essentially was just a consistent churning of the same thing year after year. the artists who were chosen or who were allowed to show in the exhibition of refused artworks, they had the choice to not show their works if they didn't want to. But it was almost seen as a sign of weakness or that you didn't believe in your work if you pulled it from the Salon of Refuses. So, you know, it was a way for other artists to see who was really about what they made and who was just kind of all talk. And there was this quiet belief that a success at the Salon des Refuses would mean an end to the jury. But on the other hand, it was vital to the jury that the Salon des Refuses was a flop. And so they kind of did everything in their power to ensure that they did everything in their power to make sure that this separate show was seen as a joke. And so, you know, due to the power of the jury, they had a choice in how the works were hung. And so they put the worst paintings near the front of the show. So as soon as visitors came in, they saw actually bad work, objectively bad work. And, you know, since a lot of the artists knew the power that the jury had, they incidentally withdrew some of their paintings. And this led to this unintentionally was a success for the jury as well, because it just kind of helped them in their cause of lessening the legitimacy of this secondary show. And the opening of the Salon des Refuses attracted a record number crowd. On Sundays, they got up to 3,000 to 4,000 visitors. And as soon as these visitors walked into the galleries, they burst into laughter once again, just like making jokes of this very serious work and this genre-bending artwork that was hanging. And many newspapers even commented, calling this show the exhibition of comics. And just going back to one of the rules of success for the Salon is having influence and making sure you control the narrative in the papers or how the work is hung or even who gets accepted. And the jury used all of those things to their advantage to make sure that this show is not taken seriously. And of the 3 canvases that Manet exhibited, one attracted the most attention out of all of them, and it was one of his most famous paintings, The Luncheon on the Grass. The Luncheon on the Grass was actually adapted from a Raphael painting, or engraving rather, called Judgment of Paris. And in fact, many of Manet's paintings were based on old master work. He sort of borrowed compositionally from them so that he could focus more on the content of the painting itself. And funny enough, Manet was attacked for the vulgarity of his painting, even though it was directly taken from a Raphael. And, you know, to the trained eye, it was blatantly obvious, but to those who just came to laugh, they saw nothing but a joke. Manet's painting was seen as vulgar because it didn't have the slick brushwork, and Manet sort of rejected the painting style of the day. Manet's painting was more simplified than most people were used to seeing, and so it almost looked unfinished to them. And so the Luncheon on the Grass was met with universal disapproval. Another painting that was seen as ugly was Whistler's White Girl. For the same reason people didn't like Manet's work, they also didn't like Whistler's. And the jury sort of sabotaged Whistler by giving his painting a place of honor and putting it near the entrance. So that was one of the first things that people saw when they came in. And once again, people laughed at the sight of this painting. I can't imagine what it would have felt like to be one of the painters in that room and just, you know, you're excited to finally have your paintings get the light of day that might have been rejected by the jury, and people are instantly laughing as soon as they see your work. It had to have been heartbreaking. But the one benefit of this show was that the young painters like Manet, Whistler, their reputation grew to the younger painters outside of the academy as the leaders of the new school. And this show cemented Manet as the leader of a new group of painters. But the public favor actually went to a rather mundane painting called Venus by Cabanel. The painting had all the tricks, you know, it was rhythmically beautiful, it had a nicely painted nude, it had all the things that were common of the day, and it was sort of innocuous, and so it didn't upset anyone's sensibilities, and so it was awarded heavily during this Salon season. And this painting was so awarded that it was purchased by the emperor, and Cabanel was given the Legion of Honor. A few weeks before Cabanel is elected into the Academy of Fine Arts, Delacroix passes away. And so as Delacroix passes away, many younger painters are sort of rallying around Manet. And it's unfortunate that Delacroix was so secluded and he wasn't able to see the fruits of his labor and of his risk-taking being grown in such a young painter who was leading the charge on what would become what we know as the starting of Impressionism. On November 13th, 1863, an imperial decree was issued. The new regulations abolished the powers and the supervision of the École des Beaux-Arts, which limited their ability to appoint new professors. And this was a blow to Ingres' power because he was able to continually select students who would reinforce his ideals. A yearly salon was also instituted as opposed to the biennial, and only 1/4 of the jury was to be nominated by the administration, while the remaining 3/4 were to be selected by exhibiting artists. But only artists who received medals had a say in the matter. But it was quickly realized that this new decree was rigged because it just reinforced the same old system just under a new patina, and people who benefited from nepotism prior to the decree still got the same benefits. The government appointed new teachers from the institute, though the newly nominated professors were more willing to compromise to the public's tastes, which was a bad thing because they were more willing to compromise for mediocrity, and they had less idealistic integrity than previous professors. With this decree, Couture and Gleyre closed their studios and taught no. 1864 left Basile, Sicily, Monet, and Renoir on their own to find out what kind of painters they could be out in the world. That's the first 3 chapters of the history of Impressionism. It's been a really informing read for me so far, and I would love to make this be a series. I want to keep trying new things on the channel, and I want to start a book club with you guys. I think this kind of stuff is really fun, and so I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. I hope you guys got something from this, and yeah, let me know if you want to see more stuff like this, and if you read this, or if you made it this far in the video, put down if you made it this far, put down keep innovating in the comments. Put that in the comments, because that's super important to art as a whole, that people continue to innovate even if they're going against the grain, even if it's not widely accepted. It's a part of the fabric of being an artist. But yeah, with that being said, thank you so much for hanging out with me today, yesterday, and tomorrow. I will see you again very, very soon. I had a blast making this, and I hope you enjoyed watching. If you haven't already, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace.
Griselda. Hey yo,